for you tonight. I've got John McLAUGHLin in the house. Would you please?
Hello and welcome to this video. That was an audience iPhone film of a recent gig by Eric Clapton at the Royal Albert Hall. In fact, it was filmed only a few weeks ago at the time of me filming this video. It cropped up on Facebook and I saw it and I thought, well, that's nice, you know. John McLaughlin's gone to see Eric Clapton at the Royal Albert Hall. John has posted out a photograph of him sat in the audience and Eric's on stage about to play Hoochie Coochie Man by Muddy Waters, and he's giving a shout out to one of the greatest guitarists that's ever lived. And it started to get me thinking, because I'm quite aware that John McLaughlin has had a long-term friendship with Eric Clapton, that he's actually over 60 years old. But to most people, they would probably think that John McLaughlin and Eric Clapton are polar opposites when it comes to guitar playing. One being quite a traditionalist rooted in the blues, and the other being this incredibly technical, expressive jazz guitarist with a whole bunch of vocabulary that went on to change the face of jazz and jazz rock. But to me, there's a strong link. There's a link between these two guitarists, first being the blues. They both picked up the guitar in a period in the 1950s when people were picking up the guitar after hearing blues musicians. And that spark unites them both. John McLaughlin has a love for the blues, but also Eric Clapton in Cream took that blues and he did something with it that no blues artists had done. He used it to create great long extemporizations and improvisations with Cream. Being really the building block of rock music, of all rock music. Because in London in the early 60s, there was a scene going on where the cross-pollination was so intense, so many different people with so many different backgrounds coming together, that all this new music started to emerge. And we get out of that the Rolling Stones, we get the Who, we get the Beatles, we get the Kinks, you know, but we also get Cream, Hendrix, Jeff Beck and Led Zeppelin. So it's a pretty intense period of time. And what's interesting is John McLaughlin was there in London from 1960 to 1969. Yes, he played a great part on that scene for 9 years. And yet when you look at interviews with John McLaughlin, he rarely mentions that. He didn't emerge onto the scene in 1969 in Miles's band and then formed Tony Williams' Lifetime and the Mavish Orchestra. No, he'd been around. And he's actually a little bit older than all these guitarists like Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck and Eric Clapton, a couple of years older. So if they knew him, which they did, they could have well been looking up to him, especially a virtuoso jazz guitarist on the scene. So what I want to do on this video is I want to explore the link between John McLaughlin and these incredibly legendary guitar heroes, explore if there's an influence there, see if there's an influence on John, see if it's going back and forth as well, and really try and describe John's period of time in London between 1960 and 1969. Now, John McLaughlin was born in 1942. He originally had piano lessons and off his mother, you know, was listening to classical music, and then his older brother introduced him to the blues. Big Bill Broonzy, Muddy Waters. He became fascinated with this. That led on to an interest in flamenco. And then from there, he discovered Miles Davis, Bill Evans, Coltrane, and he went down the jazz route. By the time he was in his late teens, he was playing professionally in a traditional jazz group called the Pete Duker Band, or Pete Duker Ensemble. Now, in England in the 50s, there's a number of different things going on, as well as the sort of burgeoning rock and roll thing that's coming over from the States, right? Which is then picked up by impresarios like Larry Parnes, who starts to sign up British versions of the rock and roll stars, and we get Marty Wilde and we get Billy Fury, right? We have our take, and of course Cliff Richard and the Shadows. We have our take here in the UK on rock and roll, but there's I'd say two or three other really important scenes. In the late 40s here in the UK, there'd been an interest in traditional jazz, Dixieland jazz, and there'd been a trad jazz boom, the likes of Humphrey Lyttelton and Chris Barber, and then later on Acker Bilk. And that created a great big interest. There was also an interest in modern jazz, all right, and that was coming to us through people like Miles Davis, but also Dave Brubeck, Charlie Mingus, a lot of the hard bop stuff. All that is swelling together. Now, here in the UK, the trad boom goes two ways. It turns through Lonnie Donegan into a thing called skiffle. And skiffle is like the punk rock of the 1950s for British musicians. You don't even have to have an instrument. As long as you've got a washboard and as long as you've got a broom handle, you could fashion together a band, and you could play the hits that Lonnie Donegan played, which actually went back to Leadbelly. And you've got to remember that Leadbelly in part goes back to the spasm bands of New Orleans in the 1890s that were doing exactly the same things, building their own instruments. So there's this line that's come through America, and now we're having the equivalent of our spasm bands here in the UK in the 1950s. And people that get swept up in the skiffle craze are people like Jimmy Page, Jeff Beck, and the Beatles. So that's going on. All this is going on. All these musicians with different backgrounds are coming to self-expression based upon, American music forms, black music, folk music. All that is coming through. John McLaughlin is swept up in that, but so's Eric Clapton. These are middle-class kids, white middle-class kids, enamored by this incredible music that's coming through them through these different sources. So, John McLaughlin has a natural ability for the guitar. He's an absolute virtuoso. He's a lot more schooled than a lot of the guitarists that built rock music. He's a reasonable reader. He knows his theory because he's been learning jazz. As I said, he gets his first pro gig with Pete Duker. That takes him down to London. He then joins Ray Ellington's band, who was the composer that did the music for the Goon Show. And in there, he has a very difficult book to read from. These charts are very difficult. And his sight reading goes up through the roof. He's in London and he gets a job at the Selma music shop. He's repairing guitars, he's selling guitars. And of course, a lot of these kids, Jimmy Page, Jeff Beck, Pete Townsend, they're all coming into the shop. Now, around about this time, I think he got that job in about 1960, and John's paths crossed with Eric Clapton around about 1962. Eric, born a little bit before in 1945, had come through the same route, but he was enamoured by the blues. Now, remember what I said about those trad jazz bands in the 1940s that had gone towards skiffle? But Chris Barber also had an interest in the blues, and this was going on to produce bands like Alexis Corner's band. And so there's this like blues interest emerging. So they try and book some gigs from some proper blues artists. And they book Muddy Waters. Muddy Waters comes over and he arrives and he does this incredibly important tour where he arrives with electric instruments. And everyone goes along and they're baffled by it. But the young kids, right, looking at the rock and roll, looking at Buddy Holly, seeing the electric guitar, all these things that are going on, it all starts to come together. And there's a contingent of guitarists that are fascinated by the blues. They're also fascinated by rockabilly guitar coming from Elvis's band, Scotty Moore. It's really hard to describe all the influences that are at play. So these two guitarists are in London in the early 60s, right? Now, I'm going to read out a couple of quotes now. So here's an extract from an interview with John McLaughlin. When I heard Eric Clapton for the first time, the sound and intensity was in line with what I was thinking about. I got to know Eric in 1962. And after that, when he was playing with John Mayall, I loved the way he was playing. He had the sound. I was playing with Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames at the time. And after I left, Mitch Mitchell played drums with Georgie till he left to join Hendrix. I left Georgie Fame in 63 to play with the Graham Bond organisation, which included Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker. So how does John McLaughlin go from working in the Selma music shop, meeting all these young kids coming up that are going to go on to reshape rock and roll? How does he get to play with these incredible players? Well, John was a good reader, and so he was picked up very quickly to do session work. Here is some footage, very early footage from 1965 of John playing with Burt Bacharach.
Trains and boats and planes all pass
So you can see John was earning his living now by turning up and doing quite middle of the road sessions, and it's quite incredible because at this time he played on a lot of classic recordings. He's on Tom Jones records, he's on Petula Clark records. If you've got Aftermath by the Rolling Stones, he's playing guitar on that. If you've got early David Bowie albums, he's playing guitar on that. He crops up all over the way on these sessions, but he's also playing with bands that are cutting edge in terms of the development of rock music at that time. The Beatles have come out. John's a big fan of the Beatles. You've got the Rolling Stones. We've got all these sort of rock bands, early rock bands, the Kinks. They're all coming out. But there's another sort of heavier scene in London around people like Brian Auger, Georgie Fame, and especially Graham Bond. So the Graham Bond organisation was filmed by the trouble genius Graham Bond, who was an incredible organ player and an incredible saxophone player and sung. But I think before we get to Graham Bond, we need to step back a little bit, because on the session scene at that time, John's getting pulled in to read these different charts, and a lot of these sessions are trying to emulate the rock and roll that's coming over from America. So he gets asked to play Chuck Berry solos. He's not really the right guy to be ripping off an adequate Chuck Berry guitar solo. So someone says at a session, I know a kid that can play Chuck Berry guitar solos, and they go out and get this kid. This kid is Jimmy Page, and he's brought in. Jimmy does a brilliant job of playing these Chuck Berry guitar solos, but he's having difficulty handling the sessions. His reading's not really there. He doesn't know how to play certain chord shapes, stuff like that. And John McLaughlin takes him under his wing at this point, and he starts to give him lessons. Right, so what we have here now is a very solid bond between Jimmy Page and John McLaughlin, and Eric Clapton and John McLaughlin. Right, as John has described here, he is going to, through the Graham Bond organisation, meet musicians like Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce. He's going to meet musicians like Mitch Mitchell that are going to go on to play with Hendrix. We can see now that John is at the centre of this nuclear reactor, which is taking pop music and rock and roll and traversing it over to being, heavy rock, classic rock, progressive rock, jazz fusion, psychedelic rock. He's at the center of this. And surely a musician like John McLaughlin, he must have been soaking that in, but also influencing what was going on around him. And we can see Jimmy Page has had a very direct influence from John McLaughlin. I'm now going to read you a quote from Jimmy Page about John McLaughlin. Well, I did meet. Not at this point, he wasn't working there at this time, but later on I was to go in, and there I met John McLaughlin. Right, now I think he's talking here about when he was working in the Selma music shop in London. He had come down from Doncaster and he was living in London. He was sort of introducing himself onto the jazz scene and welcomed with open arms, as you can imagine. He was instinctively the best. I could tell. I didn't listen to a lot of jazz, or when I did it was selective, but I could tell from what I knew that he was easily the best that I was going to hear. And then he gives that a little laugh. All witness in front of me. He was the best one I was going to see, that's for sure. He was working there really to practice all week, because the only day that was busy was Saturday. That's what he said. Fantastic. This bloke knows what he's doing and he knows where he's going. All right. So we could see by this quote that Jimmy Page he's been blown away by what he sees as being the greatest guitarist in London at that time. But it's quite interesting if we pick up an interview that Rick Beato did with Dennis Chambers, where he talks about being in a rehearsal room in London with John McLaughlin when they were doing the Free Spirits group. Now, the Free Spirits group was a trio of John McLaughlin, Joey DeFrancesco on Hammond organ, and Dennis Chambers on drums. And it was modelled after these classic organ trios that had come out of London that he'd been working. The three of the organists working at that time in London in this sort of classic. Now, the organ trios list is interesting because if you're a jazz musician, you want to go towards what's going on in popular music as you see it. There's two things you're going to try and do. One is you're going to go towards the rhythm and blues because that's very close to jazz. And also you're going to go to the organ jazz trio because it contains an electric keyboard, which has got the volume to play loud, and electric guitar. Right? The organ trios are so important for the development of fusion. And one of the things that lights the fire of fusion is the trio that John McLaughlin had with Tony Williams and Larry Young in 1970, Tony Williams' lifetime. So we start to see these threads emerging. But if we go back to the early 60s, Graham Bond, Brian Auger and Mike Carr are three organists off the top of my head that were playing that style in London. And what's interesting is John McLaughlin played with all of them. All right. So let's fast forward to the early 90s. Dennis Chambers is in a studio rehearsing with John McLaughlin, and he goes downstairs to get a cup of tea for John and Joey.
Well, that week of rehearsal with John in London, we were next door to Jimmy Page, and I didn't even know. So John sends me out in the middle of the building to get some tea, take a break for a minute while, he was showing Joey some parts for this song we had to learn. So I'm in the tea area drinking tea, and I hear this guy freaking out, talking about his teachers next door and just that blah, 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 blah. And I look up, and I didn't even connect the dots. I'm looking at the guy. I can see his face, but it didn't connect. So I'm reading on. The guy's wife comes in, and I forgot her name, and he says, blah, 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 my old teacher's next door to me, and blah, 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 blah. And she says, well, so what? You're Jimmy Page. So what? Like, you don't understand. He's one of the reasons why I play guitar.
Wow.
And, the reason why I play guitar the way I do is because of this guy. And I looked at him again and didn't connect because when I first looked up at him, he had all his hair combed back into a bun or a ponytail, like a bun.
Yeah.
And I never saw him like that before.
Right.
Because normally when you see Jimmy Page, his hair's all in his face and got the hat on and, the whole nine. And I'm looking at him, I'm like, oh, yeah, that is Jimmy. So I walked over to him and introduced myself and said I couldn't help but overhearing that, John McLaughlin was your teacher. He says, yeah. And I'm like, well, I'm playing with John. I'm working with John, blah, 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 blah. Would you like to see him? And he says, yes, I would love to see him. So I walked in, back into the rehearsal room. And I said to John, Jimmy's outside the door. And no, I've said, what did I say? I said something to the fact that, I understand that you taught Jimmy Page how to play guitar, or you were one of his teachers. And he says, yeah, what of it? I'm like, well, he's outside the door. He's looking for you. He wants to see you. And he made some comment, which I won't repeat. But I remember one thing he said, he still owes me money. That's what he said, one of the things, amongst a few other things. And I'm like, yeah, well, whatever. He's outside the door. And John made his way out there, and when John opened the door, Jimmy just jumped at him and just gave him a big hug. And, you could see Jimmy was just like just really happy to see him and talking to him. And John, had that surprised look on his face because I guess he didn't expect that kind of reaction from Jimmy.
We now have a situation where John is playing on the scene in London. He's playing in some very innovative bands like Georgie Fame's band. He's playing with Brian Auger, and most importantly, he's playing with Graham Bond. Now, at this point in time, the house bass player of Ronnie Scott's is an Irish-born New Zealand bass player called Rick Laird. And John is playing with Rick Laird. He's actually playing with Rick Laird in the Brian Auger group. Now, here's an interview with Brian Auger that describes that band and his time playing with John McLaughlin.
I was probably about 17, 18, 19 at the time. So
stepping over from that, which was very blues-edged hard bop, into playing with when some of these guys on the, you know, in the R&B club say, "Hey, bro, come and sit in, man," you know, and they play Ray Charles things, or, you know, I just felt it was easy to do that. You know, I was like, yeah, I understood the feel, and we would, you know, and so the transition when I started to play organ was not a really big deal. In fact, also John McLaughlin was on the first gig that I did, which was at the Green Man out in Bexley Heath, I think it was. Ginger was in a band with Graham Bond on organ and John McLaughlin on guitar, and there was a bass player for the Cream. He turned up in the Cream. Bruce was playing upright.
Oh, really?
And I played with Bruce when he played upright, and he was another great player. Yeah.
These musicians in these rhythm and blues stroke jazz improvisation bands are laying the foundations for the rock bands that are to come, not just in terms of influence, but also in terms of the actual musicians they're cutting their teeth. Right, so let's go into detail about the Graham Bond band, because it's fascinating. Graham Bond was an incredible musician, but a troubled musician. He emerged in London in the early 60s with the Graham Bond band, and it come out of the Alexis Corner band. Graham was an incredible improviser, very charismatic guy, but he was also very interested in the esoteric and the occult. This is something I find very interesting. Graham Bond believed that he was the illegitimate son of Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley was known as the Beast, right? And so we're looking at some dark stuff here. Jimmy Page is on that seat at the same time later on, also has fascination with Aleister Crowley. And he eventually, in the 1970s, once he'd made some money, bought Boleskine Manor, which was the old manor house that Aleister Crowley owned. He also worked on the soundtrack of Lucifer Rising with Kenneth Anger. And that feeds into the whole Led Zeppelin thing, this whole the sort of satanic deal with the devil that comes across Led Zeppelin, which is fascinating. Could well have its roots in the Graham Bond band and come from Graham Bond. When I played with Robert Plant in the Priory Brian, I had a pseudonym, and the pseudonym that Robert gave me was Aleister Crowley. Now, this is interesting because I'm connected to this story. In fact, what I find fascinating about going through these discussions is that in a way we're sort of all connected to this story, with these stories. And my connection to this story is going to get more apparent as we go on, but I'll leave that to later. You know, keep watching and you'll see how I figure in this weird story. So the other thing is that John McLaughlin is searching, he's a seeker. And through Graham Bond, he also gets an interest in the esoteric. And he joins the Theosophic Society, he starts to meditate. And by the early 70s, he is with the Guru Sri Chinmoy, who christens his new band, the Mahavishnu Orchestra. Okay? Pulling in musicians, you know, Billy Cobham, Jerry Goodman, Jan Hammer, that were all working in the scene in New York that he was now in. But he also brings in Rick Laird, which is fascinating. He brings Rick Laird from this period. So the rhythm section of the Mahavishnu Orchestra is coming directly out of this time. Now, I find it fascinating that this doesn't get discussed that much. It's bizarre because the Mahavishnu Orchestra are one of the few bands that took what Zeppelin and Cream and Jeff Beck and Hendrix was doing, and they were one of the few that took that and just took it so much further out. I can't think of any group really that went further out than Hendrix than the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and they took it out.
Rick Laird and John McLaughlin went on to be in the Mahavishnu Orchestra.
Yeah, that's right.
One of the most cutting edge. I don't think anybody's ever done anything like that since then.
Don't think so, no.
Right, in this video by the end, I hope I will have established the influence that John had on a number of musicians, but also how this influenced John McLaughlin. So when he arrives in New York in 1969 and he walks into Miles' band, not only is this guy completely down with the jazz references that Miles is working in, but he's also come from the epicenter of where this high-powered improvisational progressive rock, jazz rock, whatever you want to call it, has come from. He holds the keys to it. This is why this story is really important. Right, so let's have a look at the Graham Bond band. This is from a film, and I should have looked it up before. I think it's Gonks Go Beat or Gonks Gone Beat. It's a really strange film made in the early 60s to capitalise on this new scene that's emerging in London. And here's the Graham Bond band from this time.
Well, I was standing on the corner waiting to go home when I heard this sound that made me want to go. Well, it was coming from a dance hall across the street. It was kind of stompy with an R&B beat. It went a harmonica. Oh!
So that's probably the weirdest thing we're going to see on this video today. We can see Ginger Baker there. We can see Jack Bruce there. John was in the band at this point, and if you look on IMDb, he's credited as being in that film and in that scene. I can't spot him. He could well be playing guitar on that track. Anyway, let's have a look at the dynamics that is going on at that time in the Graham Bond band. So here's Ginger Baker talking about that band, how it progressed, and John McLaughlin's part in it.
Yeah, well, you see, after about 3 months with Graham, after we'd left Alexis, we discovered my graph had plummeted down to £12 a week again. And Graham had the nerve to tell me we were doing better than we were with Alexis. What he meant was that he was doing better than he was with Alexis, you see. So we took the band over. You know, we had this big meeting, and I'd written out 3 pages of foolscap of, you know, what was going wrong. And we took the band over. It became a cooperative thing. We kept the name, which was a mistake, but we kept the name. And, you know, like, it wasn't going that well. We were working a lot. We weren't earning a lot of money. And McLaughlin was a terrible moaner. You know, it was everything. He was one of these people that everything that happened, you know, you get people like this. And one day he was moaning at me. I was still struggling to get straight and not feeling too clever. And he moaned, and I gave him the sack anyway. I said, "Oh, if you can't stand it, John, you better fuck off." You see. So I sacked him.
So this is fascinating stuff, you know. Apparently John McLaughlin was a moaner. Now, I find this quite ironic because I can't think of anyone who's more of a moaner than Ginger Baker. He was a classic moaner. But it's interesting to get that take. It's obvious that Ginger and Jack Bruce were very close to John. So close that they actually had their own group with the singer Duffy Power. Now, remember I was chatting about the Parnes, Larry Parnes starlets that were signed up. Larry Parnes was this manager in the, he's like a Svengali more than anything else. He's very important in the history of rock and roll in the UK because he put on a number of tours. He put the people that he had like Jim and Billy Fiore and Marty Wilde alongside American rock and rollers like Eddie Cochran and Gene Vincent. People like the Beatles went to see these gigs. This just blew everyone. These tours were so important. Now, Duffy Power was signed up with Larry Parnes in the early 60s. An incredible singer. And this is one of the things I want to get across about Larry Parnes. A lot of time, it was like these people had no talent. They were just pretty boys. They were signed up. It was not the case. People like Johnny Gentle, people like Duffy Power were incredible singers. And one of the greatest singers that was signed up with like Larry Parnes was my father-in-law, Peter Wynn. Peter Wynn signed to Decca Records after winning Opportunity Knocks in 1958-59, and he was signed up to Larry Parnes. And he was on those tours that I was talking about. In fact, he played in Bristol in 1960, I think. He had never got on with Gene Vincent. I think Gene Vincent was supposed to play a show in Birmingham, I think, and he couldn't do it, so Pete was brought in to sing, and he blew everyone away. Pete had an incredibly powerful operatic voice. He was like 6'4", one of incredible good looks and this great voice. I think he used to start his shows by actually walking off stage and filling the whole hall vocally. I knew Pete pretty well because he was my father-in-law. I spoke a lot about it. Sadly, he passed away a couple of years ago in 2022, and I feel I've lost one of the people that I could explore in depth what was going on at this key time in the development of music here in the UK. He was friends with Duffy Power. Here's a photo of him backstage with Duffy, right? So Duffy Power was also, by bizarre coincidence, very good friends with my mother-in-law, my wife's mom. Here's a photo of her with Duffy in the 60s, and she can remember hanging out with Duffy. She can remember Ginger Baker, and she can remember Jimi Hendrix being around. She can remember being taken to Hyde Park to watch King Crimson, and she has also relayed little bits of information. It's very interesting to get that viewpoint of someone who's like on the side of this, and then someone like Pete that was right in the middle of this. You know, Pete was touring on these tours with Larry Parnes, right? All these musicians are turning up to see. At one point, the Beatles come to see him, and they've got a tour in Scotland booked. And they say to Pete, "Would you like to come and sing on this tour?" And Pete turns around and says, "No, you're not good enough." And so they grabbed Johnny Gentle instead. And the reason for this is because Pete, at this time, the backing group that he had on that tour featured either Clem Catini, who later went on to play on Hi Ho Silver Lining, and he's played on more hit records here in the UK than any other drummer, or Brian Bennett, the incredible drummer with the Shadows. He had Licorice Locking on bass, who was also the bass player of the Shadows, and he'd got Big Jim Sullivan on guitar and Georgie Fame, 16 years old, on keyboards. That was his band. This is the best musicians around. Big Jim Sullivan was another session guitarist on the scene. You know, people like Colin Green. There was a whole bunch of these session guitarists, and John McLaughlin is part of that session scene, right? And Big Jim Sullivan went on to become the MD for Tom Jones, and he also died a few years back. And Big Jim Sullivan had an interest in Indian music and Indian mysticism and the esoteric, and he was another influence on John McLaughlin. Right, and that was the guitarist that played with my father-in-law, right? And he was good friends with Duffy Power. Now, Duffy Power in 1965-66 forms a band, or at least he does some recordings, which feature him on vocals and the harmonica, John McLaughlin on guitar, Ginger Baker on drums, and Jack Bruce on bass. These recordings never saw the light of day, but what we see here is the precursor to Cream, right? This is right at the point where rock music hasn't even properly formed. You know, Sgt. Pepper hasn't come out, Hendrix hasn't come out, Clapton has done the groundbreaking Beano album, but with these recordings are evidence of the melting pot that was going on in London at that time. So let's have a listen to some of those recordings with Duffy, Ginger, Jack, and John.
I called you last night and the night before. I hung around knocking at your front door, asking everybody if I saw you go. They said you're out walking with Mr. So-and-so. Think of me when you get lonely. Remember that I thought of only you. It won't matter what you tell me. I found out what a cheating heart can do, and I'm a little bit blue.
Now, at some point, Ginger, who had booted John out the band because he was a moaner, then falls out with Jack Bruce. John McLaughlin moves on. He goes to Europe, he works with Gunter Schuller, he's doing a whole bunch of other things. He doesn't stay in that band. If he had stayed in that band, if that had become Cream, what a strange thing that would have been. But it didn't. Ginger was a big fan of Eric Clapton, right? And so he asks Eric to join, and Eric says, I want Jack Bruce in the band. But Jack Bruce has fallen out with Ginger. Let's have a look at these guys talking about the formation of Cream.
The idea was to carry on the idea that I'd had with Graham and everybody, was to do something that was going to be hugely successful. The main aim was, for me, was to get a band together that was going to be a huge success. Which it was.
The first time I got to know Jack was when I came back from Greece and played with John, and I was astonished by his versatility as a bass player. And then, and I'd always liked Ginger. And we just started, Ginger came to see me play with John and suggested. He drove me back to London in his Rover. I was very impressed by his car and his driving, and he was telling me that he wanted to start a band, and I had been thinking about it too. It was a sort of, it was a coincidence really, it was very synchronicity. We were all thinking about the same thing at the same time.
I said to Eric, like, I'm getting a band together. Do you want to do it? And he said, yeah. You know, we just done it. We knew it was happening. So then we said, you know, what about a bass player? And Eric had been working with Jack. He'd been playing with Jack a bit off of this, and he said, what about Jack? And I went, oh, you know. But I had to admit that Jack was the bass player, you know. So I said, I don't know. I said, I'll have to go and see him.
Ginger came round to my wife's parents' flat in Boundary Road, and he came in his new Rover, which he had just bought for the proceeds of writing the B-side of a Georgie Fame single. He came round and ate humble pie, basically.
Jack sitting at the table, cup of tea, and I said, listen, I've just been to see Eric, and I'm getting a band together, and he's doing it, and he suggested you playing the bass. I said, we're going to, like, bygones be bygones, and do you want to do it? And he said, yeah, straight away. So we had the band.
Right, so what we have here is we could see that John had at least an indirect influence, if not a direct influence, on Cream being formed. He was in the sort of prototype for Cream. When you listen to Jack Bruce singing, you can almost hear how he's taking his phrasing and tone from Duffy Power. Right, Jimmy Page has come up. He has had a direct influence as well. And I always thought it was very interesting in the 1970s, after John McLaughlin picked up his double neck SG, that Jimmy Page also did the same thing. Right. Eventually, John arrives he goes to New York on the invitation of Tony Williams. As soon as he arrives, he hooks up with Miles Davis. He plays on In a Silent Way. He then plays on Bitches Brew. He forms Tony Williams' Lifetime, and eventually forms the Mahavishnu Juncture and changes the face of rock music and jazz. Now, I think one of the things that John has described was his the influence of these rock guitarists on his tone. Right, I've got another quote here from John. I was very impressed with Eric Clapton. I was very impressed with what he was doing on electric guitar. In my opinion, he had a major impact on Jimi Hendrix. When I met Jimmy for the first time, he said he was listening to Eric, but Jimmy took it up a notch. When I heard him play the Star Spangled Banner, it was radical and revolutionary. He was revolutionary and a beautiful human being. I met him through Mitch Mitchell, who I'd played with in the Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames. Mitch was the greatest admirer of Tony Williams. So every time Mitch came to the US with Jimmy, we'd be hanging out because he'd come and see me play with Tony Williams' Lifetime. We were playing the Village Vanguard one night, and after the gig, we went back to Mitch to Electric Ladyland. There was Jimmy and maybe 20 musicians, including about 6 guitar players and bass players, and Buddy Miles was playing drums. This is when Jimmy was making his transition. I got to meet Buddy Miles that night. What a beautiful human being. We started hanging out, and Buddy took me to the gig he played with the Band of Gypsies at Madison Square Garden. That was the last time I saw Jimi before we lost him. This here, what we're describing here, is his link to that London scene. Eventually places him in a recording studio with Jimi Hendrix, right? And those recording sessions exist. Right, when I was a kid, I read about these, that they were mythical. But now down to the internet, you can just go and Google them, and you can hear John with Hendrix playing in Electric Ladyland Studios. Now, when he turned up, his guitar was feeding back, and it's not the greatest thing in the world. But what does come out of that was Buddy Miles then hooked up with John, and he recorded Devotion, and Devotion was signed by Alan Douglas, who was also, producing Jimi Hendrix at that time. Right, and he recorded that after seeing Jimi Hendrix playing the Band of Gypsies album, after seeing that machine gun guitar solo, where Jimi is channeling Coltrane. Let's have a listen to John now talking about Eric and Jimi.
I would put Jimi on a very high position. Now, it's clear that he was not the musician of John Coltrane's level, for example. But on another aspect of music, they had a great deal in common. That certainly influenced me and millions of other players, because what Jimi did to the guitar was revolutionary. I think he was held by Eric Clapton. I think Eric did fantastic work in the 60s with John Mayall and the Blues Breakers, and subsequently with my old pals Jack and Ginger with Cream. And Jimi, I think that had an impact on him, but then he took it to a different level. And I really adore Jimi. I think he did marvelous things. He had such an impact on me, because already long before, actually years before, I heard either Eric or Jimi. I didn't like this cool jazz guitar sound. For me, it was too cool. It was so cool. It was a bit cold. It missed that thing. And I've been listening to Coltrane and Miles, and of course the sheer passion of those players, and Coltrane, particularly when in 1964-65, when he brought out Love Supreme, and he's starting to play more than one note on the saxophone. Some of his notes, you can hear a chord almost. It's like distorted, and Jimi took this distortion in a fantastic way, marvelous way.
So we can see a back and forth. These rock guitarists were so important, and the influence wasn't just listening to records. John was there. John was playing with these guys, and this was going back and forth. What we see is a tag going back and forth. Now, throughout the 60s, John McLaughlin played on some very important albums. Windmill Tiller by Kenny Wheeler is a classic jazz album from that period. Experiments with Pops, that Gordon Beck did, where he took pop songs and he gave them a jazz interpretation, is really one of the first fusion albums. The album I've got behind me, Things We Like, with Jack Bruce. If I think of his first solo album in '69 that was recorded in London, Extrapolation, which lays the groundworks, right? He pulls in elements from rhythm and blues, from rock music. It pulls in elements from free jazz, bebop, and it mixes all those together through a high-powered electric guitar that does not sound like Jim Hall. These are all the things that we're getting from this. So I hope this video has been of interest to you in describing a little bit an alternative history of what was going on in London at that time. Of course, we are scratching the surface. There's so much other stuff going on. Music is made from different people, from different cultures coming together and swapping ideas, swapping approaches, swapping aesthetics. If you see a new form of music, it has to be formed like that, and it has to be placed into a pressure cooker, and the pressure cooker is the context, right? Whether it was New Orleans in the 1890s, whether it was CBGBs in the mid to late 70s. These places is a cultural thing where people are brought together. Rock music, the stuff we all love, Led Zeppelin, Free, Deep Purple, Jimi Hendrix, Cream, the whole lot of them, Black Sabbath, the whole lot of them, right? That great big hulk of rock that we see before us, right? That was born in the most part, but not entirely, because we have the American folk scene, we have the psychedelic scene out the doors, we've got Bob Dylan. All that's about to play a part too. But that is the American folk forms coming to the UK, going through this sort of transformation, and then it going back to America and affecting that there. And that literally happens, you know, when John McLaughlin arrives in New York, he takes the source of that is in London at this time. When you look at the history from 1960, when my father-in-law was playing on that incredible tour that ignited the light of rock and roll here in the UK, to say 1966, you know, when the Beatles come in and do Revolver, that 6 years period, we see culture and music entirely change. And John McLaughlin was at the heart of it. Now, if you look at interviews with him, when he's asked about this period, he often doesn't say very much. He's quite happy to regale the tales of arriving in New York and turning up the In a Silent Way sessions with Miles. And this could well be because his time in London there was a lot of drug use amongst everybody, John included. So it might be that it's all a little bit fuzzy and it's all a long time ago. But also, it could be that, you know, John was searching, and it wasn't until he arrived in America and hooked up with people like Tony Williams and Miles Davis that he was then able to express himself in a way that he's frustrated about. When you read the interviews with John at this time, he is very frustrated when he does talk about it, of being on this sort of treadmill of the commercial session scene. I've always thought that is a little bit contradicted by the incredible music that Graham Bond did, that Brian Auger did, the incredible music he did with Duffy Power. So it's an anomaly. I don't fully understand it. I have been able to talk to people like Robert Plant and a lot of the older guys around here that were on that scene at that time. In fact, I was chatting to Kevin Gammon this morning, who was the guitarist with the Band of Joy with John Bonham and Robert Plant before Led Zeppelin. And he was telling me just so much stuff about that scene. And he was going, don't forget to mention Phil Seaman. Don't forget to mention Tubby Hayes. They were so important. You know, I remember Graham Bond, we played with him and he was out of his head and he was telling me all these stories that were going on at that time. You know, him, you know, buying a guitar amp off, you know, Pete Townsend through the money he sold a guitar to, you know, Keith Richards and all this stuff. It was a melting pot. And my friend Kev, he was in London, not playing in some blues band. He was playing with Jimmy Cliff doing ska and proto reggae. You know, a white kid from my town at 16, 17 years old, playing that music in London alongside the Rolling Stones, alongside Hendrix, alongside Led Zeppelin, and alongside John McLaughlin. It's bizarre, right? I am so fascinated, and I never feel like I get to the bottom of it. But to bring this video, you know, full circle, the evidence is there. The evidence of John McLaughlin sitting there with a smile on his face with his friend of 62 years, Eric Clapton, the mutual love they have, the fact that he was brought out to play Eric's Crossroads Guitar Festival, right? And to see Eric Clapton on stage with his strap, with that Palestinian flag on his guitar, right? At nearly 80 years old, still making a statement and mentioning John, sending the love out to John, and then playing Hoochie Coochie Man, which is where it all goes back to. It's like a whole circle has been drawn together in that little bit of iPhone footage. And I must admit, I had a tear in my eye watching it. What an incredible 60 years. What an incredible body of work. What a beautiful achievement of human beings to create all this incredible music that went out there and reached people like me and shaped my life in such a way that I could sit there and see all these tiny little connections of my personal life to that scene, including meeting my wife and my kids being born. And as I get older, I find this fascinating. Now, when we ask all these things about modern music, and we look at Spotify and AI and all the you know, and people, you know, going about Taylor Swift, is she any good or is she not good, or it's not like the Beatles, all this type of stuff. Right. What has changed is music is no longer the cultural vehicle for these ideas. Right. John McLaughlin wanted to change the world. Right. He had almost a nervous breakdown in trying to do it. He had a journey going from 1960s in that shop in Selma, in the Selma music shop, right, in Garrick Street or wherever it was. I probably got that wrong. You know, from there, the journey all the way through, you know, of leaving his country, of having to go to the birthplace of the music he loved, to form the Mavish Nuksha and achieve what he wanted. The Mavish Nuksha went out into the world and it touched me. Right, I did, in discovering the Mavish Orchestra, I then went to John Coltrane, and in discovering John Coltrane, that opened me up, right, who had come from a very scientific, rational family. It had opened me up to this idea of a spiritual life linked to aesthetics, linked to art. Thank you, John. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, John Coltrane. Jimi Page, thank all of them for doing this, because in all their own way, what they did was so much more than just rock. But my God, did they rock.